Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're venturing to Kenya to unpack a really compelling situation.
Yeah, it involves a 22-year-old named Titus Wekesa.
Exactly. And we're looking at it through the lens of this fascinating Kenyan podcast called Gumzo Lamta.
We've got some excerpts from their show, right? So it's a
Yeah.
very direct perspective.
Totally unfiltered. And our mission really is to understand what this whole I Must Go saga tells us about, freedom of expression online.
Youth activism, too, that's a big part of it.
And just the general political tensions simmering in Kenya right now.
And it's interesting how this one guy's story, Titus Wekesa, being arrested for what really seems like online satire, it just opens up this window onto much bigger things happening in Kenyan society and politics.
Absolutely. And central to understanding all this is Gumzo Lamta.
Right, the podcast.
Yeah, hosted by Kama and Shiro. They get into Kenyan politics using Sheng.
Which is that mix of Swahili, English, other local languages.
Yeah.
Very vibrant.
Exactly. It's streetwise, dynamic. It's definitely not your typical formal political analysis. It's how a lot of Kenyans, especially younger people, are actually discussing these events.
Well, just using Shang is significant, isn't it? It immediately says who they're talking to. It's a break from the usual commentary.
For sure. It's a language of connection for so many young Kenyans.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into this I Must Go saga. The main guy is Titus Wekesa. He's 22, a volunteer teacher from Kwao.
Right.
Now, he was using X, formerly Twitter. His handle was @thief5th, and the username I Must Go.
Quite provocative names.
Yeah, and what got him into trouble were his posts, memes, parodies, that kind of thing. They seemed to impersonate President Ruto.
And even suggested Ruto might resign.
Yeah, suggested he was thinking about resigning because of pressure.
Okay. And it's key here, isn't it, that the Gumzo Lamata hosts, Kama and Shiro, they kept calling this satire.
Exactly. That's crucial for understanding their whole take on it.
Right.
So the official reaction was, well, pretty fast, and arguably quite heavy-handed.
The DCI, the Directorate of Criminal Investigations, they arrested him.
For supposedly violating Section 23 of the Computer Misuse and Cybercrime Act.
Which usually covers things like hacking, spreading malware.
Right. But here the accusations were, well, pretty serious. Hate speech.
Wow.
Potentially inciting ethnic divisions, and misleading Kenyans into thinking the president was actually quitting.
Wow. That really throws up that big question, doesn't it? Where's the line between, online jokes or satire about public figures and speech that's genuinely harmful or could incite violence? It's a global issue, really.
It is. And that's exactly what Kama and Shiro got into on their show. They sounded genuinely shocked at how strong the reaction was.
They just saw it as satire, plain and simple.
Yeah, and they were asking, why target this young guy, this hustler, someone just trying to get by for making a parody?
Especially when, as they pointed out, fake accounts and trolling leaders online is, well, pretty common, isn't it?
Very common. So their perspective is very much grounded in that everyday reality.
It really highlights maybe a disconnect, between how officials might see online humor and how maybe younger people who grew up online actually use it and understand it.
For sure. The internet's opened up all these new ways to comment on politics, and maybe the older structures are still figuring out how to deal with it.
Seems like it.
So the legal side moved fast. Wekesa ended up in Milimani law courts. Bail was set a KSH 1 million bond or KSH 100,000 cash bail.
Which is quite a bit of money.
It is. And significantly, the Defenders Coalition, a human rights group, stepped in and paid the cash bail.
Ah, okay. So they clearly saw this as more than just a minor online thing. It had big implications for civil liberties, presumably.
That seems to be the implication. And we saw others react, too. Activists like Hanifa Farsafi, opposition figures like Eugene Wamalwa.
Wamalwa's from DAPK, right?
Yeah, and he straight called it government oppression. So Wekesa's arrest quickly became, a political flashpoint.
And connecting that back, maybe the strong reaction to his posts shows a government that's, well, perhaps quite sensitive to criticism.
Especially from younger people online.
Potentially, yeah. Those who are really active in that digital space.
Which leads us right into the bigger picture stuff that Gumzo Lamta talked about. They didn't see Wekesa's arrest in isolation at all.
No. They linked it directly to what they called the Ruto regime's Vibaya moves.
Right, Vibaya meaning bad in Sheng. So basically the administration's bad or wrong moves.
And that's where their podcast gets really interesting, tying this specific case to a wider feeling of, well, dissatisfaction.
Definitely framing Wekesa's situation as part of a pattern.
So what were some of those other Vibaya moves they mentioned?
A huge one, according to them, were the Gen Z protests in 2024.
Ah, yes, the finance bill protests.
Yeah,
Triggered by tax hike.
exactly. They describe people flooding the streets, even storming parliament.
And MPs supposedly escaping through tunnels. That's quite an image.
It really is. Shows the intensity.
That scale of protest,
Yeah.
especially driven by young people, it says a lot about the level of feeling, the dissatisfaction with policy direction.
But the police response, sadly, was tough. Tear gas, reports of live bullets being used.
And the casualty numbers became contentious, didn't they?
Very much so. The Kenyan National Commission for Human Rights reported 39 deaths. But President Ruto claimed it was 25.
Right.
And Kama and Shiro on the podcast, they specifically pointed out that discrepancy, like, hang on, these numbers don't match.
That kind of conflicting information, especially around something so serious, it really risks undermining public trust, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Lack of transparency, questions about accountability.
Yeah.
They also brought up a specific case, Osama Otero. He's a social media influencer.
Okay.
He alleged he was beaten by police during those protests. President Ruto actually apologized on X, promised action.
Right, I remember that.
But the Gumzo Lam-Ta hosts, they questioned it. They basically said, okay, but where's the visible justice? Has anything actually happened? They suggested it might just be propaganda. Empty words.
That highlights that skepticism that pops up when people feel there's no follow-through on official promises, especially with alleged police misconduct.
Then there's what the podcast called the judiciary beef.
Ah, the tension between Ruto and the courts.
Yeah. They discussed Ruto publicly criticizing judges, accusing them of corruption for blocking things like his housing levy and other reform.
Which is a serious charge to level against the judiciary.
And they mentioned alleged threats from Ruto to ignore court orders. They even compared it to safari suit dictators like Moi back in the day.
Wow, invoking Moi, that's a strong comparison.
Yeah, referencing that time when people worried about the executive overriding the courts.
That whole dynamic, the executive versus judiciary, it really hits at the core principles, doesn't it? Rule of law, separation of powers.
Exactly. Publicly slamming judges like that can really undermine their authority.
Definitely a concern.
And it wasn't just domestic stuff. Gumzo Lam-Ta also touched on regional relations.
Oh, what about them?
Well, reports that Ruto's government might be aligning with rebel groups, like the RSF in Sudan or M23 in the DRC.
Okay, that's controversial.
For sure.
Yeah.
And the hosts pointed out the negative vibe this creates with people in Sudan and Congo. They feel Kenya isn't that neutral peacemaker anymore.
Yeah, moving away from neutrality could have big diplomatic consequences for Kenya's role in the region.
And finally, the economy. They really dug into the economic struggles.
Which are significant, right? High debt levels.
Exactly. High debt, controversial reforms like cutting fuel subsidies, privatizing state companies.
Things that faced court challenges and protests themselves.
Right. And the consequences they highlighted were, well, joblessness, high prices for basic things.
Everyday struggles fueling that discontent.
Definitely.
Yeah.
They also mentioned Ruto firing almost his whole cabinet in 2024.
Oh yeah, the big reshuffle.
But Kama and Shiro saw it more as like a PR stunt, an attempt to calm down the protesters rather than fixing the root problems.
So a lot of cynicism there about the government's motives.
Seems like it, from their perspective. But what's really striking listening to Gumzo Lam-Ta is how much they emphasize Sheng and youth culture through all this.
Right, it's not just the language they use, it's part of the message.
Totally. Kama and Shiro see Sheng as more than just slang. For them, it's a powerful tool. It unites young people, lets them express political views.
It validates their way of communicating as a legitimate form of political talk, doesn't it?
Exactly. They even brought up King Kafu from Ghetto Radio.
Oh yeah, what was his take?
He apparently believes Sheng can actually help overcome negative ethnic divisions, bring young people together across those lines.
Interesting point.
And they saw Titus Wekesa, the I Must Go guy, as using Sheng online to, as they put it, speak truth to power in a way that connects with young Kenyans.
So it challenges those older ideas of what proper political talk sounds like, shows how these informal ways of speaking can be really powerful for mobilizing people.
Yeah. And they acknowledge, that not everyone sees Sheng the same way.
Like academics versus people on the street.
Pretty much. They mentioned Dr. Maloba Wekesa, an academic who might not classify it as a formal language, but then they contrasted that with Mta scholars.
Mta meaning neighborhood or street.
Yeah, people like Lillian Kaviti and Boozy, who come from the communities where Sheng is everything. They stress its actual economic and social importance. It's tied to identity, even how people make a living in the cities.
It really shows how language evolves, doesn't it?
Mhm.
Especially in diverse urban settings. What's informal to some is vital culture to others.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into the I Must Go saga and what Gamza Lamta had to say, what are the main takeaways for you, the listener?
Well, first, I think Titus Wekesa's case just really highlights that tension, which we see everywhere, between free expression online, especially satire,
Uh-huh.
and how governments react to criticism in this digital age.
Definitely. And Gamza Lamta gives us such a valuable, grassroots view on the bigger issues fueling youth discontent in Kenya. It's not
Yeah.
just about one tweet.
No, it's clearly connected to wider concerns. And the hosts, Kama and Shiro, they seem to think Wekesa's situation might signal a broader pushback against dissenting voices.
Particularly Gen Z voices who are using online platforms in Sheng so effectively.
Right, and their discussion just weaves together all these threads, political grievances about governance, the judiciary.
Plus the economic hardships, anxieties about regional stuff. It's a really complex picture.
It is. And finally, the podcast really drives home that Sheng isn't just slang. It's a vital cultural force, important for youth identity and political chat in Kenya.
Looking forward, based on Gamza Lamta, there's a mix, isn't there? Hanifa Farsafi urging caution for online critics,
Yeah, be careful what you say.
but also a really strong call for continued activism. The hosts stressed organizing, voting, keeping the pressure on the government.
Their overall assessment seems to be that the current political situation feels a bit unstable. With the protests, the court battles, the regional issues.
And they seem to believe that collective action, even without one big leader, can still make a real difference.
Yeah, that power in numbers, even if decentralized.
So, maybe a final thought for you listening. Just consider the power of language and humor in political conversations.
Yeah, how different groups, different generations use these tools to engage with or push back against authority.
What role does satire really play in holding power accountable? And, well, what are the risks for those who use it? Definitely something to think about.